Welcome to the Cycling in Alignment podcast, an examination of cycling as a practice and dialogue about the integration of sport and right relationship to your life.
Greetings and salutations, Space Monkeys. Before we begin our episode, a brief reminder that this podcast depends on support from the audience. The reason I am able to continue with this project is because of the support of patrons. If you are a member of my audience and you feel I have offered you insight or added value to your cycling journey, please consider a visit to my website, colbypierce.com, where you can make a contribution to the Cycling in Alignment podcast. You can support the show for as little as $8 for a one-time contribution, or choose to subscribe as an ongoing member. Thank you for your consideration. Here's your reminder to think critically, act intuitively, and pedal consciously. Hello there, my little acorns. One more walking podcast before we jump into some guests. And I'll try to offer something worth recording. Standard operating procedure. It's a beautiful, clear night. Many stars are watching me walk. And this is a reminder to go look at the stars once in a while. This is important. It helps us remember that we're part of the cosmos. In case you forgot, it's been another hot minute since I've had a chance to record. The river's been flowing full strength, and this has put a bit of space between my opportunities to record, so I appreciate your patience. Last week I returned from a trip to Spain and Italy, where I coached at the TMEF coaching camp for the Strada Bianca Fondo, which was super fun. Really nice experience. I've done a lot of bike races in my life, but never quite made it to the world tour. The big show. I was kind of on the fringe of that, I suppose you might say, at times. And the chance to be around a race at the caliber of Strada was pretty special. Also, riding bikes in Tuscany is, well, to quote Ferris Bueller, it is so choice. If you have the means, I highly recommend it. Riding there is spectacular. It's like heaven for cyclists. And don't get me wrong, Boulder's a really nice place to ride bikes, but Tuscany is Tuscany. And the pasta, and the Chianti, and the biscotti. Or what are they called there? Now I've forgotten the word already. It'll come to me. I can feel Nathan turning over in his bed right now as he's waking up, trying to inspire me to remember the words. And we were there for a few days to preview the course and give our thoughts to the riders on how they might perform best in the Strada Fondo. And then we got to watch the pro race from a VIP area, see the women go by and see the men go by, and then watch the women's race, which had a spectacular finish on the edge of my seat. And what a beautiful moment that was. And then the next day we woke up to unscheduled rain, and that changed things quite a bit. By the end of the day, our derailleurs were unrecognizable. It was as if our bicycles had been fire hosed with concrete. The dirt there is just, it's like sand mixed with glue. And it dried, and the sounds coming from the drivetrains in the second half of that event, mashing, grinding metal, destroying watts, just trying to make the bike move forward. And riding into the piazza was really special. And also, I had a firsthand account of why the women almost dumped it in the last corner, all three of them, because racing for the line over those, whatever they are, they're not cobbles. They're like tiles. That was cool. Super fun experience. I recommend. And in case you didn't know, I'll be coaching again at a couple more camps this year for Team EF coaching. One will be in Boulder. We're going to have a Boulder gravel camp, June 3rd through the 7th. We had one last year, and it was a really nice experience. If you'd like to come and ride some gravel, learn things about how to pilot a bicycle around uneven surfaces while feeling at ease, experience the Boulder gravel lifestyle, then reach out. Come join us. Send me a note. I'll send you some details. And then I'll be coaching again, of course, at our November camp in Girona. That camp always takes place about a week before Thanksgiving, so we can get the World Tour riders home in time to enjoy some time with their families between Thanksgiving and Christmas, and give them at least a few weeks a year where they're not traveling and racing and training super hard. And so that dictates the pacing of our camp, or the timing of our camp, because we overlap the tail end of our camp with the beginning of the World Tour team camp. And so you get a special insight into all things at the highest level of sport. And it's a pretty unique camp because I don't think any other teams open their doors quite as much as we do. So if you're interested in that one, there will be details on our website about that camp shortly. So you can check it out at teamefcoaching.com. And onward to the thoughts I'd like to share during this soliloquy. Another spectrum in my mind. Everything seems to be spectrums. And often when I explain a concept, I reference the ends of the spectrum. And this is, dare I say, living in the Tao. By that I mean by recognizing the polarities of whatever we're talking about, all things, we can find the middle path. Wu Wei, perfect action. Because when we pick preferences, we form division. And division is, well, it's the opposite of what is. So it's an artificial construct. It's a barrier in your mind. It's a fence you create. And fences cause problems. Unless you're talking about your yard. And then the opposite rule applies, which is good fences make good neighbors, right? So, walking past my friend Nick's house right now. Hopefully he's not going to call the police on me. He's threatened to call the police when he hears that crazy guy walking around the neighborhood talking to himself. Don't do it, Nick. Be my friend. Okay, stars, what do you have to teach us this evening about spectrums? So, the spectrum that's floating around in my head right now is that of, well, we could say it's that of the child and that of the wise man, or that of the athlete who is coached prescriptively, in opposition to that who is coached or coaches him or herself descriptively. And what am I getting on about? Well, I'm talking about power meter culture, of course. The undoing of our sport. Those who seem to ignore all the normal rhythms of progress and improvement, and instead want to relentlessly be told what to do and set personal records. So a coach who writes training prescriptively will use a power meter to tell someone how hard to go in their submaximal rides or in their maximal efforts. All rides can be classified as either submaximal or maximal, or all moments of a ride can be broken down into these two polarities. And one of the most essential pieces of cycling that people don't often understand is that most of cycling can and should be submaximal. It is an endurance sport, first of all. You have to finish the race before you can think about winning the race. So you have to endure. And I don't just mean in the ride. I mean day after day, week after week, month after month, and even season over season. If you're a true endurance athlete, you make improvements over these timelines. When we add the dimension of time, we begin to think about problems differently, in a more complex manner. Prescriptive training is when a coach will assign an athlete intervals or a zone 2 ride, and they will tell them you should ride at a particular output. The output will be 200 watts plus or minus. This is pretty common. A zone 2 ride will be 180 watts to 200 watts, or whatever your zone 2 happens to be, whatever your range is. And Training Peaks even goes so far as to give the coach an option when they're using their workout builder, which is the prescriptive aspect of a workout, where on your head unit, it tells you what to do. And the coach can either pick a range or a target. You can target 200 watts. And this leads to type A plus mindset, which is the idea that when you're talking about submaximal rides, you can do it better by being at the top of the range, or you can pick a target at the top of the range and just be at it for the whole time. And there are several absurdities that come out of this mindset. One of them is that in a submaximal ride, by being at the top of the range, you're doing it better than if you were at the middle of the range or the bottom of the range. And this defeats the purpose of a submaximal exercise. The point of submaximal riding, that is endurance riding for 4 hours, to give you a generic example, or even 90 minutes. The point is to maintain a certain load on what we'll say colloquially is the aerobic system, and hold that pressure and let the body absorb that pressure. And that's it. That's the point of the workout. But the pressure internally is what signals the body to adapt to stimulus, not the external load. So when you're using power, which is a modeled or calculated external metric, what you're doing doesn't make sense, because you are using an external output to try to influence the metabolism inside an athlete. Let me put it another way. Mitochondria don't know how many watts you're producing. They don't give a fuck about strain gauges. Mitochondria feel lactate levels, hormone levels, hydration levels, the supply of glucose or lipids as fuel, the balance of oxygen to CO2. These are the signals that mitochondria feel, so to speak, the strain, the internal strain that these tiny little factories feel inside the muscle cells. And there are lots of other signals that the body can register as strain too. Things like blood pressure and cortisol levels, nervous system fatigue. All of these factors lead to, we'll say, a global sense of strain that the athlete experiences. And this is why when you ride at your zone 2, whatever that is, in your range, we'll use 190 watts as the target, halfway between 180 and 200, which would be somewhat common. When you do this for the first hour, it feels relatively easy, maybe a 6 out of 10. And then in the second hour, it feels like a 7 out of 10. And then if you do a really crappy job of fueling and hydrating, or maybe if you're kind of fit but not really fit, In the third hour, it starts to feel pretty hard. And in the fourth hour, it's closer to holding your hand on a hot stove. It can feel quite uncomfortable. So now our sense of strain has changed significantly since the ride started. And I'm breaking this down into an easy example to illustrate the point. And the point is, it doesn't make sense to use power to try to quantify the amount of stress or load our mitochondria have on our system. This makes no sense. But the prescriptive athlete doesn't understand any of these mechanisms. Or worse, they have some idea of them, but they intentionally choose to ignore them and assume that if they just hold the throttle at 190 watts for 6 hours, that they will eventually adapt and learn to ride at a perceived exertion of 6 at 190 watts for all 6 hours. And this could be the case. But then you're not doing a zone 2 ride. You're not doing a submaximal ride. What you're doing is a progressive ride. And that's not what your coach prescribed to you. Even better is when the coach doesn't understand this. Now, we can use heart rate to help us figure out how much internal strain we're feeling. And there's some tracking there. Heart rate is a measure of nervous system response to exercise load. But heart rate, just like HRV, can go either way. Heart rate can be depressed when you're tired. Heart rate can be elevated when you're tired. Heart rate can be elevated for seemingly no reason, a reason we can't figure out. It can do with hormones or caffeine intake or temperature, etc. Like take today, for example. Today was unseasonably warm. And I noticed my heart rate was elevated, not even riding around, just existing. Because my body is adapting to this air quotes spring climate, which is really a lot more like summer right now, even though it's March. Extreme weather is the new normal, by the way. So the prescriptive athlete is effectively behaving like a child. Children want to be told what to do, and they thrive in a structured environment. I'm talking about small children before they go through too many rebellious phases. And of course, a child will start to push boundaries and limits with their parents, but that's not really what I'm getting at. I'm talking about the simplest archetype of childlike behavior, which is dependent upon the parent for survival and instruction, and really helpless to make any decisions in their own interest. And at the most fundamental, or we'll say starting level between the coach and athlete, this is the nature of coaching. And this is the nature of how athletes perceive cycling to be. And the power meter is really the device that has brought this upon the sport, especially for athletes who started the sport with power from the first day or very, very early on in their cycling journey. And the same exact paradigm applies to maximal efforts, whether it's 20-minute intervals or 1-minute intervals or sprints or whatever. We have a prescriptive mindset. You're doing it right if you perform your 5-minute intervals at 350 watts or 450 watts or whatever it is, 250 watts. The number is irrelevant. The point is that there's some sort of modeled percentage, probably based on your FTP. In order to do a good 5-minute interval, you should be able to ride at an IF or intensity factor of 1.08 or 1.10, 110% of your threshold for 5 minutes. And again, I'm just kind of making up numbers that might fit the model to illustrate. And if you don't perform at this level, you're not doing it right. You're failing the workout. And this can have benefit. This type of training can help the athlete learn, in certain instances, what they're capable of. This is the upside of power. So for someone who doesn't really understand this type of training, or really how many gears they have access to, so to speak, metabolically, or in terms of effort, if they're not really aware that there are actually kind of multiple speeds you can go above threshold, different energy systems you can tap into, then these types of quantifications can help the athlete become educated about what they're capable of. And in some instances, it can help them really break through, learn more about how to work with their bodies and perform in sport. Cycling it's somewhat unique in this aspect because it's one of the most quantifiable sports that there are in terms of output that a human can do. And it's also a sport that commonly requires multiple energy systems to be functional and on demand, or well trained, we'd say, in order for an athlete to be capable of performing in multiple different types of events with any depth. So a road race where you've got to be explosive and follow attacks, or be off the front in a group and take short, sharp pulls at the front and then recover, and then blast up 10-minute climbs or 20-minute climbs, or chase onto a group through a valley after a descent, or whatever. Cycle racing in particular requires a lot of change in pace and access to multiple energy systems with the ability to return to a baseline and recover. It's different from rowing, cross-country skiing, running in that respect. Most of those other sports are really just giant fitness competitions. I mean, there's some nuance, so I'm simplifying, but basically you just get out there and open the engine up wide open. You open the throttle all the way and you just go like hell until you cross the line. And that more or less determines what place you get. And so when people treat cycling like a marathon and they train prescriptively, and this isn't bad, but it lacks depth and nuance. And it lacks the true understanding of what we're trying to accomplish in training, which is to have a rider that has multiple dimensions to their abilities. And the downside of prescriptive training, in particular with maximal efforts and intervals, is that progress isn't linear. Well, there are multiple downsides, but this is one of them. Human physiological progress is not linear. It's like any other process in nature, which you've heard me say this before, but there are very few straight lines in nature. There's a few trees that are pretty straight, and there are the edges of crystals. Those are two good examples I can think of. There aren't a lot of others. And while crystals have some straight edges, when you zoom out, you see the fractally complex lattice work of a crystal. You understand that it's not the straight lines that give it its form. It's the interrelation of those lines and the interrelation of the energetic pattern that created the crystal. So when an athlete prescriptively follows a training program, or a coach writes training in a prescriptive manner, the athlete can either undershoot the targets and then become defeated in the workouts because they feel as though they're not doing enough, even though it is absolutely and commonly possible for an athlete to be actually training at the correct load in terms of internal strain, but they're not meeting the power meter's arbitrary lines of external modeled requirements, i.e. they're not in the correct power target or power zone. So the athlete thinks they're failing. And conversely, the athlete can overshoot power targets on a day where they're having a breakthrough ride and begin to second guess the power meter or hold back at the wrong moment. And these are little instances where the power meter defeats us because it prevents us from either putting another brick in the wall or the foundation of our fitness house on a day where we could have done good work and we held back, because we thought we were doing it wrong or we weren't good enough. We second-guessed ourselves. Or we hold back because we're unsure that our effort could be this good. That's probably less common, but it happens. And the worst occasion is when that happens on race day. In particular, if you're using your power meter to pace a time trial. If you're having a banger day, like you're smashing your PRs, and you're holding back because you can't believe the numbers, well, this is a problem. The other problem with power meters and prescriptive training, which is arguably more common and a bigger challenge, is the Han Solo effect. I frequently thought of this example when I've been talking with riders about power meters and coaches about the problems power meters cause. And just the other night, I caught this wonderful movie on TV, and it reminded me of this example. And this is, of course, The Empire Strikes Back. And we all remember, I'm sure, the scene where they're trying to trap Luke in Bespin City and put him in the carbon freeze chamber, the carbon freezing technique. And they're trying to lure Luke into the trap. But first, they have to get him there. And in order to get him there, they bait him. How they bait him is they torture Han and Chewbacca. And the assumption is they torture Leia too, but this was the space bikini era. And so they didn't quite go that far in the movie. So we just see this torture scene with Han. And if you remember, they've got him strapped into this vertical gurney kind of thing. And then they lower him down onto this electronic board with these electrodes or pokey things sticking out. And there's electricity flying around and whatnot. And Han knows what's happening. So he's kind of wincing and grimacing and crying out and yelling even before he touches these electrodes. And this Han Solo effect is exactly what can happen when people associate a certain number on their power meter with a certain amount of pain. And I'm here to tell you that the nervous system, it can become a really good pain predictor. So power meters can become our own little Han Solo world, where if you're conditioned to believe that a particular number will hurt just like you're being electrocuted by Darth Vader, guess what's going to happen when you hit that number? You will feel that pain. I've experienced this, where I've looked down at my power meter and saw some number that I was convinced was bad. And then my ride didn't go well. So let's say you're halfway up a giant climb and you're not quite with the leaders and you had your hopes constructed around being in the lead group or even making the lead group suffer on your wheel during this day. And there are 12 people ahead of you and they're starting to gap you a bit, and you look down and you see the number 338, 342. And there's 4K of climbing to go, and it's steep. And at that moment, your mind does nervous system math, which is, oh, if I'm already here, I'm screwed. And there are lots of problems with this paradigm. One of them is that if you saw 338 for 1 second on your head unit, that doesn't mean anything. But even if you're using 3 or 5 seconds smoothing on your head unit, that still doesn't really mean anything. And so a mature racer, someone who is in command of his emotions and containing or centering his energy or her energy, will have the maturity to, the wisdom to observe these numbers without attaching value to them. It's really the same game as when you step on a scale. And it's the same problem when we as humans decide that one number is a good number and another number is a bad number. And to this day, this still drives me a bit nuts because we are 25 years into power meter culture, 30 actually. And there's still people who go around saying stuff like, I was making 450 watts in that guy's wheel and I couldn't believe it. And this entire sentence is filled with what I would call empty signifiers. Now, the emotion and the experience are real. Don't get me wrong. But the reason they're real is because you made them real. Because you put yourself in the Han Solo torture machine. Stop doing that. I'm just telling you, stop doing that. Stop assigning value to numbers. Numbers don't have value, which is not to say they're meaningless. Numbers have a lot of meaning. But when you attach some human value to them, goodness or badness, well, you're just creating division. You're separating yourself from the number. That's a pretty obtuse concept. I'll give you that. But it's true. And when we assign good or bad to numbers, we put ourselves in that torture device. I should have looked up what that thing's called. I'm sure there's some like Star Wars Reddit fan page about exactly what that machine's called and more detail about it. That would have been cool. Maybe I'll do that and make that the title of the podcast just to confuse the crap out of everyone. This is a big challenge with power meters, as people begin to anticipate numbers as good or bad, and it influences their performance. You can do the same thing with heart rate. You can do it with any numbers, just about. You can do it with kilometers to go in a bike race. We do lots of creative things with numbers in our mind movies. And these are pitfalls of prescriptive training. Prescriptive training means a coach doesn't have to think about how an athlete is actually physiologically responding to load. They can just robotically assign, do this, do that. And the athlete trains and trains and trains. And even if those numbers are somewhat close to the physiological response we're trying to bring about in a training session, there's no depth to that coaching. There's no depth of understanding to what we're trying to accomplish. Now, the wise woman or wise man will understand that the numbers aren't good or bad, and the numbers aren't the purpose of training, that power is not the purpose of training. Power is a tool that we use to help us achieve load and understand load, but it's only one tool, and it has no real insight into physiology. I mean, yeah, it gives us trends to physiology, but not understanding. There's no depth. There's no real understanding of what system you're using, how fatigued your muscles are, what kind of state your hormones are in at any given moment. Those things are measured by internal load, by internal sense of strain. And when I say measured, I don't really mean measured, because we can't really measure that right now. And you know what? I don't think we ever will be able to. So for those of you who are desperately trying to measure everything, I would offer that this is also ultimately the perspective of the child. The child wants certainty. The child wants resolution. The child craves straight lines. And that's not the way this game is played, my friend. I'm sorry to be the one to break it to you. There is no certainty in this game except internal knowledge and understanding. There is no certainty except experience in the moment, presence, and being open to what you are feeling. That is certain. That's the ultimate certainty. A wise man or wise woman doesn't depend on numbers to tell them what they're experiencing. The wise man or wise woman experiences what they're experiencing and then looks at numbers as a reference point. Part of the experience. The external part. But the important part is the internal part. That's the whole point. The entire purpose of sport is to have an internal experience, to have a greater understanding of what your body and your mind are capable of when you apply them with focus and intent. And the paradox is then sometimes we see the best numbers we've ever seen, and sometimes not. A watt is not a watt. You heard it here first, like 15 episodes ago. On the other side of the spectrum, we have descriptive training. What does descriptive training mean? Descriptive training is, of course, the opposite of prescriptive training, and it means that we can describe what type of effort we want the athlete to experience and then let them drive the ship. And as coaches, of course, we give them a framework from which to work. Example, let's say that we decide that an athlete's going to work on maximal aerobic power, or what might more commonly be referred to as VO2 max intervals. And so we're going to pick a format where we think that we will elicit this type of response from the system. We will give the athlete intervals that will bring them near or to their maximal aerobic consumption, oxygen consumption. And we'll give them enough duration in this intensity to keep them there long enough to have a training effect. So if we hit VO2 max for an athlete for 60 seconds, that may not be enough to get a training effect. Now we can define the term training effect and get even more nuanced. 60 seconds of actual VO2 max is still a solid minute. We could consider that some sort of maintenance. It really depends on how fit you are and what your goals are. This context is not trivial. But for most athletes who are trying to perform well in the modern variants of cycling, we could suppose that we might want to elicit VO2 max for 3 minutes, 5 minutes, maybe 8 minutes, somewhere in that range. And if you're going much more than 8 or 10 minutes of actual time at VO2 max, there aren't many athletes who can sustain that. There are a few, I think. But the median is probably around 5 minutes. So 5-6 minutes for most athletes. That's why we might use a 5-minute maximal interval to quantify VO2 max power as a one-time effort. And so let's say we're going to give someone 3-minute efforts, and we'll give them 90 seconds of recovery so that they hover around that VO2 max mark, and we'll give them 5 of those. So 15 minutes worth of work with 90 seconds recovery. And we imagine that, to get to VO2 max, it takes a few minutes worth of work, even at the output. This is the other part that's a bit deceiving. So if you had someone do 5 by 3 minutes at the required power, and even if they strictly respected the recovery window and they were a good prescriptive athlete and they did everything in the zone, we might imagine that they are at VO2 max for the last minute of the second interval, the second half of the third interval, most of the fourth interval, and just about all of the fifth interval. And each time they recover, their oxygen consumption goes down a bit in between. And it goes down less each time because there's a cumulative weight to each of these efforts. And if we give them a prescriptive model and a target, and they hold on to that power for each and every effort, well, then the power was linear and the aerobic load was nonlinear, but approaching some sort of plateau, especially for, we'll say, the last 2 efforts roughly. And so we might end up with a total of, I'm kind of making up numbers, 6, 7, 8 minutes at or close enough to VO2 max to where it counts. At 90 to 100% of their VO2 max. And we might call that a successful workout. So I'm not here to tell you prescriptive workouts don't work. They can. What I'm saying is they're not the best way to train if you want a true understanding. And here's why. It's also possible that we give someone a longer set because we're working with a very fit athlete and we want them to, we really want to make sure that they experience VO2 max for the full duration of what they're capable of. So we give them a 7x3. That's a pretty long set if you're really doing it at true VO2 max intensity. And if we keep the recovery short, 90 seconds or half of the interval length, then the athlete will definitely be challenged to maintain that output, even with a prescriptive model. Most athletes would be challenged to do this. So their power is going to decay for the last few reps. And that decay might take them first to the middle of the map range and then to the bottom. And then it might even decay down to threshold. Meanwhile, heart rate is still very high and effort is through the roof. So we've got three different things happening here. We've got heart rate that's gone up and plateaued. We've got effort that went up, 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 and up, and up. And then we had power, which started high and then decayed. So what do we watch? And if the athlete has no understanding of the nuance of this type of training, they could easily conclude that they suck, or that they failed, or that they started off the set too fast. And so then we get into the nuance of how the athlete was coached, and also how accurate the zones are. And a few other details like, well, what was their cadence? Because cadence will influence oxygen consumption. Lower cadence and more torque will put less demands on the system and more on the muscular system. So some athletes who are quite physically strong might start to choose a lower and lower gear, or maybe they'll self-select a lower gear to begin with because they don't really want to work that hard with their aerobic metabolism because they associate it with a Han Solo effect. Or maybe their cadence changes wildly because they're just flailing around like a fish and they're desperately trying to avoid that constant high load. So they're in and out of the saddle or they're shifting gears nervously. You can see this with some athletes when the cadence, the power is relatively constant, but the cadence is just up and down and up and down. This is an athlete who we could say, assuming they're in the saddle the whole time, they're kind of squirming under the effort. This is common. It's not good or bad. It's just an observation. How is the athlete solving the equation? What is their strategy? And as coaches, we can begin to understand how the athlete's strategy impacts their performance and the physiological effect, as well as give us an insight into their psychology. Are they athletes who like to take their hand and hold it on the stove and see how long they can fry their skin? To use a very old analogy that Jonathan Vaughters and I came up with as juniors. Or are they really squirming under the effort? Are they incapable of holding constant power? Maybe because they've got a trend towards, we'll say they're challenged to hold constant attention, challenged to concentrate under intense pressure. And each of these types of athletes, there are coachable moments in all of these experiences or all of these outcomes. Because all these athletes really present in a certain way that offers the coach the ability to have a greater understanding of what's happening. And what's my first rule about athletics? Know thyself. So as an athlete, when you see these behaviors in yourself, or as a coach, when you see your athletes performing this way, you can just ask the question, what do I see? This is one of the most important jobs of a coach, is to simply witness what they see in the athlete and reflect it back to them. Be a mirror. And as an athlete, to hold a mirror to yourself and honestly look. This is one of the most honest and significant things you can do for self-improvement. Really honestly look at yourself and have an understanding of how you are moving. What does your movement practice look like? How do you perform under different levels of pressure on the bike? How do you avoid certain types of load? And how do you embrace other types of load? And what is the psychology behind that? It's quite interesting. This is the nuance of athletics. This is why we're here, is to understand these things. It's like the whole point. It's the gold. It's the alchemy of the athlete that is interesting. So an athlete who works descriptively, or who coaches descriptively, they'll offer a different paradigm, which is that of the structure of the workout. And the athlete or the coach will instruct the athlete to use this framework to achieve a certain load. And then they will give them parameters upon which to execute that framework. They'll give them goalposts or mile markers. No, wait, kilometer markers. Better. Miles are stupid. No freedom units on this podcast. And this is the way of the athlete who has the maturity and depth to understand the why, what we're trying to accomplish, and then apply it from a neutral perspective, without the perspective of ego, without the childlike need to impress their coach. I gotta say, I have a lot of amazing athletes. And, well, all my athletes are amazing in their own way. But numbers don't impress me. I mean, sometimes they do. It's like, wow, okay, you really smashed it there. But at the same time, they're just numbers, right? I'm not assigning value to their power numbers. It's more like, how did you feel? Are you making progress? Are you achieving PRs? Are you covering new ground in your own development as an athlete in a way that is sustainable, a way that has depth? Or are you grasping for PRs? Are you building the structure with too high of a ceiling without an adequate foundation? This is the question we must ask as a coach all the time. And most intervals, most days should be, in a sense, quite average, quite sustainable. Just a hard day of work. We don't have to set PRs. We don't have to compare this 5-minute interval or this 3-minute interval or this 20-minute interval to our all-time PR best. What we're doing is we're eliciting a certain physiological response during training, and then in the rearview mirror, we look at the numbers, or we observe the numbers without judgment during our efforts to help guide us. And we watch them with impartiality. This is the path to true progress. Then one day you look at your numbers and you go, wow, look how far I've come. Look how many watts I made and how easy it was. I set that PR and I didn't feel like I had to blow my brains out to do it. It came with a sense of rhythm, with a sense of flow. It came from a sense of balance between effort and relaxation. This is the essence of the mature cyclist, embodying the wise man, or at the very least, embodying the archetype of the true warrior, which is someone who is grounded and balanced and centered and understands exquisitely their craft. An athlete who trains descriptively might have parameters such as, okay, today we're doing 3-minute intervals, and the anticipated rep range for you is going to be between 5 and 7. So let's call it 6. And what I want you to do is do the number of reps that you can execute with perfect form. And you're going to stop before your form decays. You're going to stop the reps before your power decays. You're going to perform the maximum number of reps, leaving the decayed rep in reserve, so to speak. Because in today's workout, we're only interested in a clean execution. And this flies in the face of how most people would do intervals. Most people assume that in order to do intervals effectively, you have to treat it like a weight workout, which means you have to blow your brains out in the last rep. Grind yourself into smithereens. It's one of the best words, smithereens. It's kind of like gargantuan. I mean, how often do you get to use gargantuan in a sentence? And then you put it down and walk away. And you understand that by executing only 4 or 5 perfect 3-minute intervals with crisp form and attention, without undue compensatory movement patterns or substituted movement patterns, without excessive strain, without excessive squirming in the saddle or desperate slobbering, that you've done enough work. You put it down and you know that you've done your work for the day. And you are walking the path of the endurance athlete in a sense that you have chosen to make these efforts in a way that will allow you to get a good night's rest and get up tomorrow and go do your endurance ride without carrying over all this fatigue. The true professional or the truly mature warrior, king, or even wise man will do efforts always with an eye on tomorrow's workout, always knowing there's more to come, and always keeping a little bit in reserve in training. Professionals almost never, we might even say never, fully empty the tank in training. Not the good ones. Because they know that you can only empty the tank so many times in one season. And there are professionals out there who never learned this lesson. One in particular, I will not name names. I know this because I've seen his data. He had a habit of setting PRs in training, never in races. Think about that for a minute. Now, it's one thing if you eclipse a PR by a few watts, right? A handful of watts within the range of error of a power meter. Okay, that's a solid ride. We take it. And of course, in training, every once in a while, we have a breakthrough because progress is nonlinear. But this is different than someone who season over season, month over month, sets PRs in training, and this never happens on race day. This is an athlete who is a child, an insecure child, and they are training harder than they ought to. I intentionally avoided the use of the word should because I don't like to should all over people. See what I did there? There's my dad joke for the night. Ooh, I just got passed by a Zoomy scooter. They're everywhere now. So I'm not here to tell you that if you are being trained prescriptively or you train people prescriptively that you're doing it wrong. I am here to tell you, though, that there's a better way to do it with more depth, more understanding, and that power meters are limited in their ability to offer insight into an athlete. Very limited. They are an indicator of physiological load, but they are not physiological load. They are a proxy for what we are trying to accomplish, which is physiological load. So, in the Taoist tradition, don't mistake the finger pointing at the moon for the moon. Don't mistake the power meter for what we give a shit about. A more direct way to say the same thing. Thus ends my line of thought for the evening. As always, I hope you found this helpful. I found it clarifying for me to walk and explain my thoughts. Thank you once again to everyone who contributes to the podcast. I'm very grateful for your consideration in that respect. Your financial contribution helps keep this project rolling. And there are more interviews coming with other humans, I promise. Thanks again for your patience. As always, I encourage you to think critically, pedal consciously, and of course, act intuitively. The Tao doesn't take sides. It gives birth to both good and evil. The Master doesn't take sides. She welcomes both saints and sinners. The Tao is like a hollow bellows. It is empty, yet infinitely capable. The more you use it, the more it produces. The more you talk of it, the less you understand. Hold on to center. Attention, well dippers. Did you know that I offer a unique service at my studio in Boulder, Colorado? An integrative fitting is the culmination of my experience and understanding that helps an athlete have a deeper insight into their relationship to cycling and movement. This is understood in the context of how the dream, goal, or objective aligns the client's choices and habits. The psyche, the environment, and drive will all influence the current expression of athletic ability. As we understand these factors, we can shape and direct athletic potential. What this means in a practical sense is that we spend about 6 hours working together, including a short or outdoor ride. We will film you on and off the bike, and we will discuss an extensive intake questionnaire. You will leave the fitting with a unique perspective on your function and with actionable pathways to improve your performance. This service was created specifically to help cyclists who have been through various fitting sessions and have had unsuccessful or unsatisfactory results. We dig deeper to find more meaningful outcomes. If you are interested in knowing more about an integrative fitting, please visit my website, colbypierce.com, where you can book an appointment. Epilogue. I want to share a few brief thoughts about the inception of Cycling in Alignment. The purpose of this podcast is for me to get 3.5 decades of hard-fought lessons out of my skull. Some of them through my own research and reading. Some of them I've been taught through mentors and colleagues, other riders, other racers. A lot of it, a massive amount of it, was simply trial and error through my own stubborn methods. And that has amassed a certain amount of experience and knowledge, understanding. And while I think I'm reasonably smart and I know quite a bit of stuff, I want to make it clear that the opinions that I share on this podcast are belief systems built on what I've experienced to this point. And that some of those opinions are pretty strong, but they are also loosely held. That is to say that if I learn more about a topic and have a greater level of clarity or understanding, then my old belief systems will be abandoned and I will now operate under that newfound knowledge. So I'm not here to tell people all the things that I know. I'm here to explain what I've learned to this point. And there's a big difference. Also, that is the intent when I discuss things on the pod with guests, is to learn from them and have a discourse. Because if we can't have a discourse as adults, then we've lost one of the basic tenets of modern society. Even if we disagree, we ought to be able to, in most cases, shake hands and walk away. Because after all, this is sport we're talking about, and while sport is training for life, it's nothing to get too upset over. The purpose of the podcast is to help me help other people, and specifically to help them actualize their highest potential by illuminating a path that enables alignment with their truth, their intent, and their coherence. That's really the end goal. So I'm grateful for your listening. My intent is also not, to be clear, to gain an audience or become popular or gain social status in any way. I don't care about that stuff. That said, if you feel an episode that you have heard will help someone you know, please share it with them. That helps us reach the end goal, which is to help more people. Thank you for listening. I'm grateful for your time and attention. Blessings.